Welcome back to News Talk. A mistrial in the William Porter case. He's the first officer to go to trial out of 6 in the Freddie Gray death case in Baltimore. Now, Baltimore is a city on edge. Demonstrations lasted through the night, but they were peaceful with just 2 arrests. Here with more now on the hung jury and what's next in this case is attorney GAYLE Trotter. Welcome to News Talk, GAYLE. Good to see you.
Great to be with you.
So a mistrial really is a loss for the prosecution, right? They just didn't have a strong enough case?
It is a loss for the prosecution, and you might remember that there was a lot of pressure to bring this case and to bring it quickly, but now we see that because the jury was unable to convict on any of the counts, that perhaps the prosecution did not have all the evidence that they wanted in order to make this case.
So this officer was charged basically with 2 things. One, he didn't strap in Freddie Gray in the paddy wagon, and he didn't call for help when he was asked to. So the jury ultimately didn't find these to be criminal offenses? Is that how it worked out?
He was charged with 4 offenses, and essentially based on the facts of those 2 things you just mentioned, the failure to buckle Freddie Gray in and the failure to call for medical assistance when requested. Now, the real interesting thing is going to be to try and find out how many jurors were in favor of convicting on any of the charges and how many of the jurors were against it. And I think as the prosecution goes forward and tries to decide whether to bring this case again, they're going to want to have that information to know if there were 11 jurors who were against any type of conviction on any of the 4 charges, or if it was more evenly balanced, or it was just one lone holdout for acquittal.
So we know that the jury was comprised of, I think it was 7 women and 5 men. Is that correct?
Right.
Do we know anything else about this jury?
We know a little bit more about them, but the judge has basically said that he doesn't want that information becoming public. And as you know, there's a lot of pressure on a jury in a high-profile case like this. And we want to respect the sanctity of the jury deliberations. So the effort to go and get this kind of information, especially for a community like this where the case is so neuralgic, coming out with the names of the jurors could put a lot of pressure on them. And we want to make sure that the constitutional rights of all the officers are observed and that they have the ability to defend themselves and have due process of law, which was the case in this situation.
You know, a lot of people are wondering, well, why did the prosecutor start with the Porter trial? I mean, he was one of the officers, African-American officer, but certainly not the one charged with the most serious of crimes. So why did they go there?
This goes to the strategy of the prosecution. The prosecution needed the statements of Porter to be admissible in the cases of the other 5 officers. So that's why they decided to go in this order with the cases. And this creates a lot of problems going forward. Are the next 5 trials going to be put on hold until they retrial the Officer Porter case, or are they going to proceed with the other 5 trials and then try to come back to Officer Porter down the road?
So their choices now are to retry or to give him immunity, I guess?
Yes, and there's certainly discussions of that. The prosecution and defense attorneys are meeting with the judge today to decide if they're going to go forward, but you can probably bet that they're going to go back to the attorneys for Officer Porter and offer him a deal to have better testimony against the other officers.
That might probably be a good strategy for them because they've already shown their hand, right?
Right. It helps both the prosecution and the defense to have had this trial because they each know what the strategy is of the prosecution and the defense. They know where the holes in the case are, and they can adjust their strategy if another trial comes forward. But think of the advantage it also gives to the other officers because they know what the prosecution has done in the Officer Porter case, and that will certainly influence the facts and the evidence that they put forward in the other 5 officers' cases.
If they had gotten a conviction in the Porter trial, could they still then ask Porter to testify against the others?
He wouldn't have any motivation to do that, but they can use the statements that he made in open court for the other officers' trials.
Talk about, as a prosecutor, how much more difficult it becomes doing this a second time.
They're exhausted. After you go through all the emotional and intellectual and just the time and energy to put into a trial, the attorneys on both sides probably just want to sleep for several days, and yet they're going to have to go back before the judge today and talk about whether or not they're going to go forward with another prosecution. And I think the psychological damage is very difficult on the prosecutors, but helpful to the other 5 officers because they know that the prosecution was unable to bring forward enough evidence to get conviction on any of the 4 charges.
The Freddie Gray death happened in April. And here we are already, we've gone through one trial and it's not the end of the year. Does that seem quick to you? Some people are saying, why did they rush to trial?
Well, the prosecution, you might remember, was also criticized for not bringing it faster. So the prosecution was kind of caught between a Scylla and a Charybdis because obviously they didn't have enough evidence to get a conviction even on the lowest level of the charges, which was misconduct of the office. And so the prosecution now knows that they did go too fast to trial. But on the other hand, there was so much intense political and community pressure to go forward with the trial and run it through the justice system. So they do have at least that to fall back on.
So now I guess questions are about the timeline. I mean, how quickly could they put a new case together? How quickly could they do this? Do you think it'll be a matter of months or years?
I think it's a strategic calculation. They have the evidence. It's unlikely that they're going to come up with more evidence to present to a juror. They might choose to highlight something differently or come up with a different theory of the case. But it's more of a strategic question than a timing question on whether they're going to go forward and retry him or whether they convince him to come forward with testimony that would be helpful for the other 5 trials.
In addition to the timeline, I guess the other big question is, why did they choose to try all these officers individually, one after the other?
Oh, the prosecutor didn't want to do that. Prosecutors always want it lumped together because it's much easier for the prosecution to evince all that evidence at the same time. But it's an important principle for defendants to be able to have their day in court so that they're not charged with guilt by association. And it gives them the advantage of having a full-throttled defense and to make the prosecution each time individually in these 6 different situations to make sure that the prosecution puts forward the entire trial, the entire evidence, without being able to lump all the facts together.
You know, this case certainly incited some rage within the community. There are racial aspects about it. There are also police, maybe brutality aspects about it. Would you say it's more about race or more about police tactics?
I would say it's more about police tactics, given the fact that the community feels like it's not being heard in these situations, and I think that the community wanted this to go through the justice system, and the fact that we didn't really have a certain answer leaves the community uncertain. It probably would have been harder for the community if there had been an outright acquittal, and certainly it would have been harder for the officer if he had been convicted on any of these charges, because if he had been convicted on any of these charges, he probably would not have been able to continue with the livelihood that he has had up to this point. He hasn't been with the police department for very long, but it's a big investment of time and training. So it's something that is dissatisfying for the community, but shows that the justice system is working well.
We heard from some people in the community last night. We had our live reporters out kind of canvassing people's thoughts, and you could just tell there was this simmering feeling of rage. You know, they were restraining themselves from being violent, but at the same time, they couldn't understand. How come they can't find this man is dead? He was in the police custody. How come nobody's being brought to justice for this? So what kind of message does this mistrial send to the community?
I think we should take our cues from the family of Freddie Gray. They came out with a statement yesterday saying, "We're calm, you all should be calm. We're the ones who have the most at stake in the outcome of this case. We're calm, you should be calm." And the mayor also had a very strong statement, I think, that showed really good leadership when she talked about the constitutional rights, the balance between due process and the ability of the protesters under the First Amendment to peacefully demonstrate and show their dissatisfaction with the course and the outcome of this case.
And speaking of the mayor, there is a mayor's race coming up next year, and Stephanie Rawlings-Blake will be looking for re-election. Do you think that this Freddie Gray case will be a referendum on her time in office, whether she gets reelected?
How could it not be? Certainly how she handled it and how she handled the riots in April, and going forward what kind of leadership she gives to the community, because it's devastating on many of the people in the community, the businesses. It's not something that Baltimore wants to have out there as their reputation.
We appreciate your thoughts today, and certainly lots more talk on this subject before it is over. Attorney GAYLE Trotter, she is with the D.C. law firm Schaefer and Trotter. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll be right back.